He was a titan of industry, a man who believed his billion-dollar fortune could buy anything, including the right to belittle those who served him. Sterling Beaumont saw his maid Amara as a silent shadow in his opulent world, a woman defined by nothing more than her supposedly broken English. But on a night that would decide the future of his entire empire, in a room filled with the most powerful people in New York City, he made a fatal mistake. He mocked her accent one last time, and in the chilling silence that followed, she opened her mouth and spoke not in English, but in the flawless aristocratic French of diplomats and philosophers, and shattered his world with a single sentence. The penthouse perched atop Beaumont Tower was less a home and more a monument to conquest. It sliced into the Manhattan skyline, a glass and steel declaration of Sterling Beaumont's dominance. From 80 floors up the city was a glittering tapestry, a kingdom laid at his feet. Inside every surface gleamed Italian marble polished chrome and vast panes of glass that made the sky an intimate part of the decor. But for Amara Dubois, the beauty was a cold, sterile cage. For the past 11 months, Amara had navigated this silent, opulent world. Her life was a study in contrasts. By day she moved with practiced invisibility, her hands, which once turned the delicate pages of 17th-century manuscripts at the University of Abidjan, now meticulously polishing silver that would never be used by anyone she loved. Her voice, which once confidently debated political theory with international scholars, was now used only for quiet, deferential phrases in English. "Yes, Mr. Beaumont." "Right away, Mrs. Beaumont." "Is there anything else?" Her English was clear, precise, but tinged with the melodic cadence of her native French from Côte d'Ivoire. It was this accent, this audible proof that she was not from here, that Sterling Beaumont had latched onto like a vulture to a wound. Sterling was a man built of sharp angles and brutal ambition. He hadn't inherited his fortune. He had ripped it from the world with bare-knuckled aggression in the tech sector. Now, in his late 40s, he craved the one thing his money couldn't easily buy, the effortless legitimacy of old-world class. He collected art he didn't understand, hosted parties for people he secretly despised, and was desperately trying to acquire a legendary French luxury brand, Maison Lefebvre. This acquisition was his holy grail, the final piece in his transformation from a ruthless upstart to a global patriarch. His wife Beatrice was a different creature entirely. Trapped by a prenuptial agreement as rigid as her husband's smile, she moved through the penthouse like a ghost. She was kind to Amara in small, furtive ways, a gentle smile when Sterling wasn't looking an insistence that Amara take home the untouched gourmet leftovers. Beatrice saw the deep, weary intelligence in Amara's eyes and felt a pang of something she couldn't name, a shared, unspoken confinement. Amara's past was a country she could no longer visit. She was the daughter of Ambassador Kofi Dubois, a celebrated Ivorian diplomat, and Dr. Lena Dubois, a renowned professor of Francophone literature. Her childhood was spent in embassies from Brussels to Geneva, her world one of intellectual rigor and cultural grace. Then the coup happened, a violent, swift political upheaval that tore her country and her family apart. In the chaos, her parents vanished, presumed dead. With nothing but a forged passport and the memories of a life that felt like a dream, she had made her way to America, a refugee stripped of everything but her education and her dignity. The cleaning agency that hired her saw only a reliable worker. They didn't see the woman who could dissect the works of Camus in her sleep, or who understood the complex nuances of international trade agreements. To them and to the Beaumonts, she was just Amara the black maid, with the thick accent. The tension in the penthouse had been escalating for weeks. The Lefebvre deal was in its final delicate stage. The patriarch of the family, a notoriously discerning Parisian named Jean-Luc Dubois, a common name, but the coincidence never failed to sting. Amara was flying to New York for a private dinner. This dinner was everything. Sterling had been a storm of fury and anxiety, his temper flaring at the slightest imperfection. A microscopic smudge on a wine glass, a barely perceptible wrinkle in a tablecloth, all were grounds for a torrent of abuse, almost always directed at Amara. "Can't you understand simple English?" he'd barked at her a few days prior, when she had placed the wine glasses an inch to the left of his preferred setting. "It's right of the plate. R-I-G-H-T. "Do they not teach you that where you're from?" Amara had simply murmured, "My apologies, sir," and corrected the mistake, her heart, a cold, heavy stone in her chest. She needed this job. The meager salary was all that stood between her and the streets. It paid for the tiny room she rented in the Bronx and the small sums she sent to a network trying to locate survivors of the coup. So she swallowed the humiliation, locking it away with the memories of her parents' laughter and the scent of the bougainvillea in their Abidjan garden. On the morning of the dinner, the air in the penthouse was electric, with a frantic, oppressive energy. Sterling had a final prep call with his team, his voice booming through the marble halls. He's old school. He cares about appearances, about tradition. Everything has to be perfect. One mistake, one slip-up, and he'll walk. This isn't just about business, it's about legacy. Beatrice, pale and anxious, oversaw the floral arrangements, her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted a white orchid. She caught Amara's eye and gave a weak, apologetic smile. Amara worked with silent efficiency, her mind a fortress. As she set the long, imposing dining table, she mentally recited passages from Molière, a trick her mother had taught her for finding grace under pressure. Each polished fork, each perfectly folded napkin, was a small act of defiance. They saw a maid. She knew she was the daughter of Lena and Kofi Dubois, a survivor, and that this penthouse was merely a chapter, not her entire story. Tonight that story was about to turn a page. As she placed the last crystal water goblet on the table, she could feel a strange premonition, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that had nothing to do with the impending storm outside or the tempestuous billionaire in the next room. It was the calm before a different kind of storm, one that was brewing within her own soul. As evening fell, the city lights began to prick the deepening twilight, and the guests arrived. They were the crème de la crème of Sterling Beaumont's world, a carefully curated audience for the night's performance. There was Senator Walsh, a man whose political influence was as vast as his appetite for expensive champagne. There was Julian Croft, a tech rival, whose presence was a power move on Sterling's part, a way to show off the impending Lefebvre acquisition. And there were their wives draped in jewels, and couture their laughter as sharp and brittle as the crystal in Amara's hand. Amara, now dressed in a simple, immaculate black uniform, moved through the throng with a grace that rendered her nearly invisible. She offered canapés, her face a mask of polite neutrality. She heard snippets of conversation, stock market predictions, summer plans in the Hamptons, thinly veiled gossip. It was a language of power and privilege, a world away from the urgent whispers and coded messages of her past life. The guest of honor, Jean-Luc Dubois, was the last to arrive. He was a man in his late 60s with a shock of silver hair and eyes that held a weary, intelligent sharpness. He was not dressed in the flashy brands Sterling favored, but in a perfectly tailored suit of understated elegance. He exuded an aura of quiet authority that made Sterling's boisterous confidence seem coarse and theatrical by comparison. Sterling greeted him with an overly effusive welcome, clapping him on the shoulder. Jean-Luc, welcome, welcome. So glad you could make it. The city's all lit up for you tonight." Monsieur Dubois offered a polite, reserved smile. "Sterling, your home is impressive." He scanned the room, his gaze lingering for a moment on a garish, oversized modern art piece before moving on. There was no warmth in his compliment. Amara watched the interaction from a distance. The name Dubois was a common one in France and its former colonies, but hearing it spoken with such reverence sent a familiar ache through her. It was her name, a name that once carried weight in rooms just like this one, in conversations about art, politics, and culture. Now she was the one serving the drinks. The dinner began. The guests arranged themselves around the long table, a tableau of wealth and influence. Sterling at the head of the table was in his element. He held court, his voice dominating the conversation. He was desperate to impress Monsieur Dubois, to prove he was more than just a brutish American businessman. He began to pepper his speech with French phrases, each one landing with a thud. The wine, a magnificent Chateau Margaux. A true pièce de résistance, he announced, pronouncing pièce as peace and resistance, with a hard American R. Amara, refilling water glasses, heard Monsieur Dubois' eyebrow arch almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something amusement, or perhaps disdain, crossed his features before being replaced by a mask of polite interest. Beatrice, seated to Sterling's right, looked deeply uncomfortable. She tried to steer the conversation towards safer topics, asking Monsieur Dubois about his flight about Paris in the springtime. But Sterling was relentless. He saw the dinner as his stage, and he was determined to be the star. The first course was served a delicate scallop crudo. Amara moved with fluid precision, placing each plate silently before the guests. As she served Senator Walsh, he barely acknowledged her continuing a loud story about his recent golf game. To them, she was part of the furniture, a functioning automaton. This invisibility was both a shield and a curse. It protected her from direct engagement, but it also chipped away at her sense of self, reinforcing the vast chasm between who she was and what she had become. As the main course of roasted duck was served, the conversation turned to the Lefebvre brand itself. It's a company built on tradition, on heritage. Sterling boomed, gesturing grandly with his fork. I have the utmost respect for that. I plan to preserve its joie de vivre. He butchered the phrase, making it sound like joie de vivre. Across the table, Julian Croft, the tech rival, smirked into his napkin. He knew Sterling's weaknesses, and his linguistic pretensions were a particularly easy target. Monsieur Dubois took a slow, deliberate sip of his wine. Maison Lefebvre is more than a brand, Sterling. It is a piece of French cultural history. Its soul is in the details, in the nuances. It requires a custodian who understands its language, both literally and figuratively. The message was clear, a polite but sharp warning. Sterling, however, was too blinded by his own ego to see it. He took it as an invitation to show off more. Absolutely, I've been brushing up. My French is getting quite good. My tutor says I'm a natural, he boasted. Amara felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She could feel the condescension radiating from Monsieur Dubois, as subtle and as chilling as a draught from a poorly sealed window. She saw the embarrassment on Beatrice's face, the cruel amusement on Julian Croft's. She wanted to be anywhere else. She moved to Sterling's side to refill his wine glass. She was concentrating, blocking out the noise, focusing only on the steady pour of the deep red liquid. Her hand was firm, her movements economical. But in that moment, as Sterling laughed loudly at one of his own jokes, he shifted his arm unexpectedly, bumping her hand. A single ruby-red drop of the expensive Chateau Margaux leaped from the bottle and landed squarely on the pristine white cuff of his custom-made shirt. The laughter died instantly. A shocked silence descended upon the table. The drop of wine looked like a drop of blood against the stark white fabric. Sterling's face flushed with wine, and self-importance slowly turned a dark, furious crimson. He didn't look at the stain. He looked at Amara, and the manufactured charm, the bonhomie, the entire facade of a cultured host dissolved in an instant, revealing the raw, ugly brute beneath. Time seemed to slow down. Every eye at the table was fixed on the scene unfolding at its head. The drop of wine on Sterling's cuff was a tiny imperfection, but in his world of absolute control, it was a declaration of war. Amara stood frozen for a heartbeat, the heavy wine bottle still in her hand. "My deepest apologies, Mr. Beaumont." She said, her voice low and steady, though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "It was an accident." Sterling slowly dabbed at the stain with his napkin, his movements deliberate and menacing. He didn't look at her, but addressed the entire table, his voice dripping with venomous disdain. "You see what I have to deal with. You try to bring people up, give them opportunities, and this is the competence you get." He finally lifted his gaze to meet Amara's. It was a look of pure contempt. "Can't even pour a glass of wine," he sneered, his voice loud enough for everyone to hear clearly. Then he delivered the final targeted blow. He mimicked her accent, twisting his mouth into a cruel caricature. "My deepest apologies, sir," he mocked, elongating the vowels in a grotesque parody. "It's a wonder she can even form a sentence. You'd think after a year in this country, the English would start to stick." A wave of collective discomfort washed over the guests. Senator Walsh cleared his throat. Julian Croft's smirk vanished, replaced by a look of genuine shock at the sheer viciousness of the display. Beatrice's face was ashen. She looked down at her plate, as if willing the floor to swallow her whole. But it was the expression on Jean-Luc Dubois' face that was most telling. His polite mask was gone. He was watching Amara, his sharp eyes filled with an unreadable intensity. He saw not a clumsy maid, but a woman standing with impossible poise in the face of abject humiliation. Something inside Amara snapped. It wasn't a loud, dramatic break, but a quiet, seismic shift. It was the culmination of 11 months of biting her tongue, of swallowing insults, of burying her identity under layers of servitude. It was the memory of her father, debating at the UN with eloquence and passion. It was the memory of her mother, quoting Racine by heart. It was the sheer, unadulterated injustice of this brutish man mocking her voice, the very instrument of her heritage, while he himself was desperately and clumsily trying to appropriate her culture for profit. She had survived a coup. She had lost her family. She had crossed an ocean with nothing. She would not be broken by this petty tyrant over a drop of wine. The room was utterly silent, waiting for her to retreat in shame. Sterling was smirking, triumphant in his casual cruelty. He expected tears or, at the very least, a terrified, stammering apology. He did not expect what came next. Amara drew in a slow, calming breath. She straightened her spine, not in defiance, but in a simple, profound reclaiming of her own stature. She looked directly at Sterling Beaumont, her gaze clear and unwavering. And she spoke. Her voice, when it came, was transformed. The lilting Ivorian cadence was gone, replaced by the crisp, perfectly enunciated metropolitan French of the Parisian elite, the very accent Sterling had been trying and failing to imitate all night. It was the French of the Sorbonne, of the Élysée Palace. It was flawless. "Monsieur," she began, her tone calm and devastatingly precise. "L'élégance véritable ne se trouve pas sur la manchette d'une chemise, mais dans la manière dont on traite les autres. C'est une nuance qui vous échappe, semble-t-il." The sound of her perfect French filled the silent room like a symphony. The guests stared their forks, hovering forgotten over their plates. Beatrice's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. Amara's words translated to, "So true elegance is not found on the cuff of a shirt, but in the way one treats others. It is a nuance that seems to escape you." She wasn't finished. She glanced at the wine bottle in her hand, the Chateau Margaux that Sterling had so proudly mispronounced. D'ailleurs, il s'agit du Château Margaux. Le T à la fin de Château est muet, et le X à la fin de Margaux l'est également. Ce sont les bases. Besides, it is pronounced Château Margaux. The T at the end of Château is silent, as is the X at the end of Margaux. This is basic. The impact was catastrophic. She had not only replied in a French far superior to his own, but she had publicly corrected his pronunciation, exposing his cultural posturing as the fraud it was. She had done it calmly, without raising her voice, with the detached air of a professor correcting a particularly slow student. Sterling's face went from crimson to a sickly, mottled white. The smirk was gone, replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure shock and fury. He looked as if she had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to retort, but no words came out. He had been so thoroughly, so elegantly dismantled that he had no reply. The silence that followed was different. It was no longer just uncomfortable. It was electric, charged with the magnitude of what had just happened. The power dynamic of the entire room had been irrevocably altered by a woman he considered less than nothing. And across the table, Jean-Luc Dubois, the man on whom Sterling's entire future depended, slowly placed his fork and knife down. He was no longer looking at Sterling. He was looking at Amara with an expression of utter, unadulterated astonishment and profound intrigue. The maid had just become the most interesting person in the room. The immediate aftermath of Amara's response was a tableau of suspended animation. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the distant, indifferent hum of New York City traffic. Sterling Beaumont, for the first time in his own home, was utterly powerless. He had been stripped bare in front of his court, his performance exposed as a pathetic sham. The spell was broken when Beatrice let out a small, involuntary gasp. The sound seemed to jolt Sterling back to life. His shock morphed into a tidal wave of pure rage. His face contorted, and he pointed a trembling finger at Amara. "You're fired!" He roared, his voice cracking. "Get out! Get out of my house! Right now!" Amara met his furious gaze without flinching. She placed the wine bottle carefully on the sideboard, her movements still measured and deliberate. She gave a slight formal nod. "As you wish, monsieur." She turned and began to walk toward the kitchen, her back straight, her head held high. Her exit was not the scuttling retreat of a disgraced servant, but the dignified departure of someone who had concluded her business. As she left the room, erupted into a flurry of awkward motion and hushed whispers. The guests, embarrassed and unsure of how to react, began to make their excuses. My look at the time said the senator's wife, suddenly fascinated by her watch. "We really must be going, Sterling. Early day tomorrow," Senator Walsh mumbled, avoiding eye contact. Julian Croft, the tech rival, simply stood up, a slow, almost imperceptible smile playing on his lips. He had witnessed the self-immolation of his competitor. It was better than any business deal. But Jean-Luc Dubois did not move. He remained seated, his eyes fixed on the doorway through which Amara had disappeared. He had heard more than just perfect French. He had heard a specific accent, a particular intonation that was achingly familiar. It was the French of the educated Ivorian elite, an accent he hadn't heard with such clarity in years. It spoke of a certain kind of upbringing, a certain kind of world. Sterling, now on his feet and pacing like a caged animal, turned his fury on his remaining guest. "Can you believe the nerve? The absolute disrespect. I'll have that agency shut down. Sterling." Monsieur Dubois said, his voice cutting through the tirade like a shard of ice. "Be quiet." Sterling stopped, stunned into silence by the command. Monsieur Dubois slowly folded his napkin and placed it on the table. He stood up, his demeanor cold and decisive. "The evening has been illuminating," he said, his choice of words deliberate. "I believe I have seen all I need to see." "Jean-Luc, wait." Sterling pleaded, the desperation now seeping through his anger. It was nothing, just a disgruntled employee. "On the contrary," Dubois replied, his eyes flinty. "I believe it was everything. You wish to be the custodian of a French legacy, yet you have shown tonight that you possess no understanding of the values that underpin it. Respect, dignity, and a certain finesse. You are a man of great volume, sterling, but very little substance." With that, he turned his back on the sputtering billionaire, but he did not head for the main elevator. Instead, he walked purposefully toward the kitchen. Sterling and Beatrice were left alone in the wreckage of their perfect dinner party. The opulent room now felt like a tomb. "How could you let this happen?" Sterling rounded on his wife, his voice a venomous hiss. "She worked for you. You hired her." Beatrice, who had been silent and trembling, finally looked up at him. For the first time, there was no fear in her eyes, only a profound, weary contempt. "I let this happen?" she asked, her voice dangerously quiet. "No, Sterling, you did this. You did this all by yourself." She stood up, her own resolve hardening. "And I am done watching." She walked away, not towards their shared bedroom, but towards her own private suite, the click of the closing door sounding like a final verdict. Meanwhile, in the stainless steel sanctuary of the kitchen, Amara was untying her apron. Her hands were shaking now, the adrenaline of the confrontation beginning to recede, leaving a tremor of fear in its wake. She had just lost her job, her only source of income. She was adrift again. What had she done? The kitchen door swung open. She expected to see a security guard coming to escort her out. Instead, she saw Jean-Luc Dubois. He stood there for a moment, simply observing her. "Mademoiselle," he said, his voice much gentler than it had been in the dining room. Amara looked up, startled. "Monsieur," she replied, her voice reverting to a more neutral, formal French. "That was quite an extraordinary moment," he continued, taking a step into the kitchen. "May I ask where you learned to speak my language with such authority?" Amara hesitated. Revealing her identity was a risk. In her world, being the daughter of a deposed diplomat was as dangerous as it was prestigious. "I was educated in French, sir." "As was I," he said, his gaze intent. "But your accent is not from Paris, nor Lyon, nor Marseille. It has the warmth of the sun in it. It reminds me of Abidjan." Amara's heart skipped a beat. He was perceptive. Too perceptive. "I am from Côte d'Ivoire," she admitted quietly. Monsieur Dubois nodded slowly, a look of dawning comprehension on his face. He took another step closer. "My apologies for the intrusion. But your name?" The head housekeeper mentioned it was Amara. "Your last name, please." She weighed her options, the lie of her current life or the truth of her past. Looking into his intelligent, searching eyes, she felt an inexplicable flicker of trust. After the humiliation she had just endured, the truth felt like the only possession she had left. "My name," she said, her voice clear and steady, "is Amara Dubois." Jean-Luc Dubois froze. His face paled. He stared at her as if seeing a ghost. "Dubois," He whispered the name, a fragile thing in the sterile kitchen. As in Ambassador Kofi Dubois. Tears welled in Amara's eyes, the first she had allowed herself to shed all night. She could only nod, unable to speak, past the lump in her throat. The old Frenchman's composure finally broke. He sank onto a nearby stool, his hand covering his mouth. Mon Dieu. He breathed, his voice thick with emotion. Kofi, I knew your father. I knew him well. He was a great man, a brilliant, honorable man. We served together on a trade commission in Geneva 20 years ago. I heard what happened. The coup. I never knew. I never imagined. He looked up at her. His eyes filled with a mixture of horror, pity, and a fierce, protective anger. He saw her not as a maid in a uniform, but as the daughter of his respected former colleague, a woman of breeding and intellect reduced to serving brutes like Sterling Beaumont. To find you here, he said, his voice trembling with indignation, in this place, serving that buffoon. It is an obscenity. In that moment, Amara knew that the ground beneath her feet had shifted once more. This was not just an intrigued businessman. This was a link to her past, a witness to the life that had been stolen from her. The confrontation in the dining room had not just been an ending. It was, she realized with a dawning sense of wonder, a beginning. The sterile industrial kitchen of the Beaumont penthouse transformed into a sanctuary of shared history. The clatter and tension of the disastrous dinner party faded, replaced by the hushed, reverent tones of remembrance. Jean-Luc Dubois, the formidable Parisian patriarch, now looked at Amara with the eyes of a man seeing a cherished ghost. Your father, Jean-Luc began, his voice still heavy with disbelief. He had a mind like a diamond, brilliant, multifaceted, and unbreakable. He spoke of you and your mother constantly. Lena, the literature scholar. He said her intelligence was the only thing that could ever truly humble him. And you were his star of Abidjan. He was so proud of your academic achievements at the university. Hearing her parents described with such love and respect by a stranger undid Amara. The carefully constructed walls she had built around her grief began to crumble. She sat on the stool opposite him, the simple black uniform feeling like a costume from a play that had mercifully ended. I didn't know if anyone remembered him, she confessed, her voice thick with unshed tears. When you lose everything, you begin to wonder if it was ever real. It was real, Jean-Luc affirmed, his tone fierce. Do not ever doubt that. The world of diplomacy lost one of its brightest lights when Kofi disappeared. We all mourned him. He leaned forward, his expression hardening with purpose. Tell me what happened, Amara. Tell me how you came to be here. And so she did. For the first time since she had arrived in America, she told her full story. She spoke of the terrifying night of the coup, the soldiers at their gate, the hurried, desperate escape her parents had orchestrated for her. She spoke of the last words her father had told her. Survive. Do not let them extinguish our light. She recounted the perilous journey, the loss of contact with her family, the agonizing uncertainty, and the slow, grinding process of seeking asylum in a country that saw her as just another nameless, faceless refugee. She explained how her degrees and qualifications were worthless without the proper documentation, how she had taken on cleaning jobs to survive, and how the agency had placed her with the Beaumonts, a post considered prestigious because of the high pay. Jean-Luc listened without interruption, his face a mask of growing horror and indignation. When she finished, a heavy silence hung between them. This is a travesty, he finally said, his voice a low growl. A daughter of Kofi Dubois, polishing silver for a man who mistakes arrogance for culture. No, This will not stand. He stood up and began to pace the kitchen floor, his mind clearly racing. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a man on a mission. Sterling Beaumont wanted to buy a piece of French heritage. He does not understand that our heritage is not in our handbags or our perfumes. It is in our character. It is in our loyalty. It is in honoring the legacy of people like your father. He stopped and looked at her, his decision made. This changes everything. My deal with Beaumont is finished. I would sooner set fire to Maison Lefebvre than hand its legacy to a man like that. I will make my withdrawal public in the morning. I will be very clear about my reasons. Amara was stunned. Monsieur, you can't. Your business... My business will be fine. He cut her off gently. Some things are more important than profit. Your father once did me a great service, a personal kindness during a difficult time in Geneva that I have never forgotten. To honor his memory by helping his daughter is not a choice. It is a duty. It is a privilege. He pulled out his phone. We will start immediately. You cannot stay here. You will come with me. My hotel has a suite for you. Tomorrow we will contact my lawyers. They are the best. We will sort out your immigration status, your professional credentials. You are a scholar, Amara. You belong in a university, not in a kitchen. He paused, his expression softening. And we will use my resources to find out what truly happened to your parents. The networks I have, they are extensive. If there is any information to be found, we will find it. For Amara, it was too much to process. A few minutes ago, she had been a fired maid facing homelessness. Now she was being offered a lifeline, a bridge back to the person she was meant to be. It was a dizzying, terrifying, and exhilarating prospect. I don't know what to say, she stammered. Say nothing, he replied. For now let us simply get you out of this gilded cage. As they prepared to leave, a member of the building's security staff appeared at the kitchen door sent by Sterling to escort Amara from the premises. He was a large, imposing man, but he stopped short when he saw her standing with Jean-Luc Dubois. Sir, there seems to be a misunderstanding, Jean-Luc said, stepping in front of Amara protectively. Mademoiselle Dubois is with me. She will be leaving through the front door. The guard, confused, but unwilling to challenge the billionaire's most important guest, simply nodded. Yes, sir. Of course, sir. Amara Dubois walked out of the kitchen, leaving her apron folded neatly on the counter. She walked past the dining room where Sterling was now on the phone, his voice a frantic, pleading bark. He saw her and his eyes widened in fury and confusion as he saw who she was with. She did not look at him. She did not look at the marble floors or the priceless art. She walked with Jean-Luc Dubois toward the private elevator, her past walking beside her, her future waiting ahead. As the elevator doors slid shut, sealing her off from the world of Sterling Beaumont, she felt the first true breath of freedom she had taken in a year. The inferno of the dinner party had burned her old life of servitude to the ground, and from the ashes something new and strong was already beginning to rise. The morning after the dinner party, the fallout hit Sterling Beaumont with the force of a wrecking ball. He woke up not to the deferential quiet of his penthouse, but to the frantic buzzing of his phone. The first call was from his COO. Sterling, what the hell happened last night? Jean-Luc Dubois' office issued a press release an hour ago. It's everywhere. Sterling's blood ran cold. He scrambled for the tablet by his bed. The headlines were brutal. French magnate pulls out of Beaumont deal, citing profound lack of character. Dubois cancels multi-billion-dollar acquisition after disturbing dinner with Beaumont. Maison Lefebvre statement. Our brand is built on dignity, a quality we did not find in our prospective partner. The articles were devastatingly specific. Quoting an anonymous source from the dinner, they detailed Sterling's boorish behavior, his clumsy attempts at French, and most damningly, his cruel and public humiliation of a staff member. The story had a hero and a villain, and Sterling was cast unequivocally as the latter. His carefully constructed image as a cultured titan of industry was shattered overnight. His company's stock, Beaumont Technologies, began to plummet in pre-market trading. The Lefebvre deal wasn't just about luxury goods. It was a strategic move into the European market, a deal that underpinned the company's entire 5-year growth strategy. Without it, the market's confidence evaporated. Sterling's day descended into a spiral of damage control. He yelled at his PR team, who told him there was little they could do. The narrative was too compelling. He tried to call Jean-Luc, but his calls went straight to voicemail. He called Senator Walsh, who was suddenly unavailable. The rats were already deserting the sinking ship. His fury, unable to find a purchase on the powerful men who were abandoning him, needed a target. He fixated on Amara. She was the cause of all this, the ungrateful, treacherous Maid. He called the cleaning agency, screamed at the manager, and threatened to sue them into oblivion for planting a corporate spy in his home. The terrified manager could only stammer apologies. But the worst confrontation was yet to come. He found Beatrice in her suite, packing a suitcase. Not a small overnight bag, but a large Louis Vuitton trunk. "What do you think you're doing?" he demanded. Beatrice didn't look at him. She continued to fold a silk blouse with calm, deliberate movements. "I'm leaving you, Sterling." He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Don't be ridiculous. You can't leave me. You signed a contract. Remember the prenup. You walk away with nothing." She finally turned to face him, and he was taken aback by the strength in her eyes. The timid, anxious woman he had married was gone. "I know," she said simply. And for the first time in 10 years, nothing sounds like a wonderful alternative to this. She gestured around the opulent suite. "You know, last night I watched that woman Amara. You stripped her of her dignity, insulted her, fired her in the most vile way possible, and she walked out of here with more wealth than you will ever understand, because she has herself, her integrity. What do you have, Sterling? A penthouse full of things you bought to impress people you hate. An empire built on bullying. I built that empire for us," he roared. "No," she replied, her voice cutting. "You built it for you. I was just one of your acquisitions, the pretty wife to complete the picture." "Well, the picture is ruined now. The frame is broken." She closed the trunk and walked towards the door. "Goodbye, Sterling." He was left standing alone in the silent room, surrounded by the trappings of a success that now felt hollow and fragile. He had lost the deal, he was losing his company's value, and now he had lost his wife, all because he couldn't resist the urge to be cruel to a maid. It was an equation so simple, so infuriating, that his mind couldn't fully grasp it. He had always believed power gave him the right to punch down. He had never considered that the person he was punching might have the strength to shatter his entire world. Meanwhile, across town, in a suite at the Carlisle Hotel, Amara's new life was beginning. Jean-Luc had been true to his word. Lawyers had been consulted, phone calls had been made. An immigration specialist was already working on fast-tracking a new visa for her based on her exceptional academic background. Jean-Luc had also activated his own intelligence network. He made quiet inquiries through old diplomatic channels, contacting former colleagues in Geneva and Brussels who had connections in West Africa. He was searching for any news, any rumor about the fate of Kofi and Lena Dubois. Amara spent the day in a state of surreal disbelief. She was given a wardrobe of elegant, simple clothes. She ate a meal she didn't have to serve. She spoke in her native French without fear or shame. She found herself talking to Jean-Luc not just about her past, but about her academic work, about post-colonial theory and economic policy. She felt the dormant parts of her mind waking up, stretching, coming back to life. That evening, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal managed to get a message to her through the hotel. The journalist who had been a guest at the dinner wanted her side of the story. Amara discussed it with Jean-Luc. "The world sees Sterling Beaumont's version of events," he advised. "Perhaps it is time they heard a different one. Not for revenge, but for the truth." Amara agreed. She would not speak of her personal history, but she would confirm the events of the dinner. She gave a short, dignified statement over the phone, her English clear and articulate. She simply described the mockery, and her response ending with the line, "A person's value is not determined by their station in life, but by their actions. I chose to act with the dignity my parents taught me." When the article was updated with her, quote, "It was the final nail in Sterling's public coffin. He was no longer just a ruthless businessman. He was a classless bully who had been put in his place." The story of the billionaire and the maid became a viral sensation, a modern-day fable about hubris and humility. Sterling Beaumont's empire didn't crumble in a day, but the foundations were cracked beyond repair. His board of directors began to question his leadership. His rivals like Julian Croft smelled blood in the water and started circling his weakened company. He was trapped in his glass tower, watching his kingdom turn to ash, haunted by the memory of a quiet woman's voice speaking perfect, devastating French. 6 months later, the austere New York winter had surrendered to the irrepressible bloom of spring. On the campus of Columbia University, cherry blossoms exploded in audacious pinks and whites, their petals drifting like confetti onto the ancient stone walkways. The city was in a state of renewal, a vibrant mood that perfectly mirrored the new world of Amara Dubois. The name Sterling Beaumont had faded from the headlines, relegated to a cautionary tale whispered in boardrooms and dissected in business ethics classes. His spectacular self-destruction was complete. Beaumont Technologies, mortally wounded by the collapsed Lefebvre deal and the subsequent loss of investor confidence, had been an easy target for a hostile takeover. His rival Julian Croft had presided over its dismemberment, selling off its assets for parts. Beatrice had finalized their divorce with quiet speed, walking away from his fortune to find her own. The magnificent penthouse on the 80th floor, a monument to a fallen king, was now just another piece of prime real estate, its history of silent cruelties wiped clean for the next owner. Amara rarely thought of him. Her life was no longer defined by the shadows of others. She now stood in the light. The lecture hall was packed, the afternoon sun streaming through the tall arched windows and illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. Amara stood at the podium, not in a simple black uniform, but in a tweed blazer and dark trousers, looking every bit the academic she was. The room was silent, save for the sound of her voice, the same voice Sterling Beaumont had mocked, now holding hundreds of students captive. "And so we see," she was saying, her tone passionate, her English fluid and confident, still carrying the beautiful cadence of her home, which she no longer saw as a flaw, but as a feature of her identity. The post-colonial economic framework cannot be analyzed merely as a set of policies. It is a scar tissue formed over wounds of exploitation. To understand the present, we must be unflinching in our examination of the past. We must listen to the voices that were silenced. She was a natural. Her lectures were a compelling blend of rigorous academic theory and the raw, undeniable authority of lived experience. She didn't just teach the material, she embodied it. The students, children of privilege and strivers from around the globe, were fascinated by her. They saw a woman of profound grace and intellect who had clearly walked through fire and emerged not burned, but forged. After the lecture, a throng of students surrounded her, eager to ask questions. She answered each one with patience and depth, her mind once occupied with remembering dinner settings and polishing silverware, now joyfully engaged in the complex dance of ideas. This was where she belonged. Her new life was a tapestry woven from small, precious freedoms. She lived in a modest but sunny two-room apartment in Morningside Heights, a space she had filled with towering stacks of books, thriving green plants, and the lingering scent of the strong Ivorian coffee she brewed each morning. Jean-Luc Dubois had become her rock, a surrogate uncle and mentor. His lawyers had performed a small miracle, navigating the labyrinth of U.S. immigration to secure her an O-1 visa, designated for individuals with extraordinary ability or achievement. It was a recognition of the person she had always been. The most profound shift, however, had happened a month prior. Jean-Luc had asked to meet her at her apartment, his tone on the phone unusually grave. He arrived with a sealed file folder, his face etched with a combination of solemnity and a deep, guarded hope. Amara, he began, sitting opposite her at her small kitchen table. My contacts have found something. It is not confirmed. I must stress this. It is a whisper, a rumor from a reliable source within the Red Cross, but I needed to tell you in person. Amara's heart began to beat, a frantic, painful rhythm against her ribs. She had long ago buried the hope of seeing her parents again, burying it deep under layers of grief and resignation, because to hope was to invite unbearable pain. They were not executed during the coup, Jean-Luc said, his voice soft. The intelligence suggests they were deemed too influential to be made into martyrs. They were taken, imprisoned in a secret facility in the northern provinces, held off the books by the most radical elements of the new regime. Amara felt the air leave her lungs. The room tilted. Her parents, alive. The words were impossible, a fantasy she hadn't dared to entertain. Alive, she whispered the word, a fragile prayer. We believe so. Jean-Luc continued, his hand covering hers on the table. And there is more. The political climate is shifting. The regime is seeking international legitimacy, and there are talks of a general amnesty for political prisoners. Amara, there is a chance, a real chance, we can get them out. He opened the folder. Inside was a grainy black and white satellite photo of a remote compound. It was nothing, just a collection of buildings in the desert. But to Amara, it was the center of the universe. The place where her heart had been held captive. Hope, terrifying and overwhelming, flooded through her, so potent it felt like pain. For the first time in years, she wept. Not tears of grief, but of a desperate, earth-shattering hope. Jean-Luc had since channeled his wealth and influence into a quiet, high-level diplomatic and legal campaign, working through Swiss intermediaries to negotiate for their release. Every day was an agonizing wait for news. It was with this new, fragile hope simmering in her heart that she was walking across the Columbia campus a few weeks later. She had just left the library, the weight of her book-filled satchel, a comforting presence. She saw a woman standing hesitantly by the campus gates, a woman who looked both familiar and completely different. It was Beatrice. The expensive armor-like couture was gone, replaced by a simple, elegant dress. The anxious, haunted look in her eyes had been replaced by a quiet clarity. Amara Beatrice said, stepping forward. Beatrice Amara replied, a gentle smile touching her lips. "It is good to see you. I know this is unexpected," Beatrice said, her hands twisting the strap of her handbag. "But I felt I had to. I've read about your position here. It's wonderful. It's right." She took a breath. "I came to apologize. Properly. Not just for that night, but for all the nights I stood by and said nothing. I was living in a cage, but it was one I had chosen. You were in a cage you had not, and you were the one who showed me the door." "You have nothing to apologize for," Amara said with genuine compassion. "We all have our own struggles." "But that's just it," Beatrice insisted, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I saw you speak truth to power, with nothing to gain and everything to lose. I had everything and I said nothing. You made me see the poverty of my own existence. After I left Sterling, I felt unmade. And then I started thinking about what real strength was. It was you. So I started volunteering. I work at a shelter now for women leaving abusive homes. I'm helping them with legal aid, with finding work. I'm using my old life to help them build new ones." She reached into her bag and pulled out a small, beautifully wrapped book. "This is for you. I know it's a small thing, but I saw it in a rare bookshop and thought of you." Amara unwrapped it. It was a slim volume of poetry by Leopold Sedar Senghor, a first edition. A treasure. "Beatrice, this is extraordinary. Thank you." They stood for a moment longer, a shared understanding passing between them, two women whose lives had collided in a moment of ugliness, yet who had both found a path to a more authentic, meaningful existence because of it. Later that evening, in the quiet of her apartment, Amara sat by her window, the lights of the city twinkling below. She held the book of poetry, its worn leather cover soft beneath her fingertips. She opened it, and the first poem her eyes fell upon was one her mother used to recite in their garden in Abidjan, her voice blending with the scent of bougainvillea and the hum of the evening insects. A single perfect tear traced a path down Amara's cheek. It was a tear of memory of loss, but also of profound, defiant hope. She was no longer just a survivor of her past. She was a custodian of her family's legacy and the architect of her own future. The journey was far from over, the most difficult part, perhaps, still ahead. But she was ready. She would wait, she would work, and she would prepare. Not just for her own future, but for the day she could place this book in her mother's hands and welcome her parents home. She was Amara Dubois, and she was whole. Amara's story is a powerful reminder that a person's worth is not defined by their job, their accent, or their circumstances. It resides in their character, their knowledge, and the silent strength they carry within. Sterling Beaumont saw a maid. He was blind to the scholar, the diplomat's daughter, the survivor, standing right in front of him. His arrogance cost him his empire, but Amara's dignity allowed her to reclaim her entire world. Her journey from silent observer to the architect of her own destiny shows that the most powerful voice is often the one that waits for the right moment to speak the undeniable truth. If her story of resilience and quiet triumph moved you, please show your support. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to hear a story of hope and justice, and be sure to subscribe to our channel for more incredible tales of hidden strength and unexpected victories. Your support helps us bring these important stories to light. Thank you for listening.